The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble corridors of the royal palace, as 12-year-old Prince Alexander made his way through the grand hallways. Unlike most days when he would be escorted by a team of guards and servants, today he had managed to slip away from his tutors during their morning break. The young prince had grown tired of endless lessons about diplomacy, mathematics, and royal protocol. All he wanted was a few moments of freedom to explore his own home, without someone watching his every move. Alexander had always been different from other royal children. While his older brother Edmund focused on military strategy and his sister Catherine practiced court etiquette, Alexander spent his time observing the people who worked in the palace. He knew the names of most servants, remembered their families, and often asked about their lives. His parents, King Philip and Queen Isabella, sometimes worried that their youngest son was too kind-hearted for the harsh realities of royal life. As he wandered through the less frequented areas of the palace, Alexander heard an unusual sound coming from one of the side corridors. It was a mixture of heavy breathing and what sounded like someone trying to muffle their voice. Curious and concerned, the young prince followed the sound, his soft leather shoes making no noise on the polished stone floor. The sound led him to a small alcove near the servants' quarters, an area where few nobles ever ventured. There, hidden behind a large stone pillar, Alexander discovered the source of the distress. It was Marcus, one of the younger palace guards who had only recently been assigned to the royal family's protection detail. The guard was leaning against the wall, his face pale and his hands shaking as he tried to steady himself. Marcus was barely 20 years old, tall and strong-looking in his ceremonial armor, but now he appeared vulnerable and frightened. His usually perfect posture had crumbled, and he was breathing heavily as if he had just run a great distance. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool morning air that flowed through the palace corridors. Alexander remained hidden for a moment, unsure of what to do. He had been taught that guards were supposed to be strong and fearless, always ready to protect the royal family from any danger. Seeing Marcus in such a state was confusing and concerning for the young prince. He wondered if there was some immediate threat to the palace that he should know about. As he watched, Marcus pulled out a small piece of parchment from inside his armor. The guard's hands were shaking so badly that he could barely hold the paper steady enough to read it. Alexander could see that whatever was written on that parchment was causing Marcus great distress. The guard's breathing became even more labored, and he pressed his back against the wall as if trying to disappear into the stone itself. Marcus was new to the palace, having been recruited from a small village on the outskirts of the kingdom. He had been selected for his loyalty, physical strength, and quick reflexes. But palace life was still overwhelming for someone who had grown up in a simple farming community. The other guards were older and more experienced, and Marcus often felt like he didn't belong among them. The young prince realized that this was not a matter of external danger to the palace. This was something personal affecting Marcus, something that was causing him to struggle in a way that Alexander had never seen before. The guard kept looking at the parchment and then closing his eyes tightly, as if trying to make the words disappear. Alexander's natural compassion overcame his uncertainty. He had been raised to understand that with privilege came responsibility, and that those in positions of power had a duty to help those who served them. His parents had taught him that true nobility was not about titles or wealth, but about how one treated others, especially those who had less power. Taking a deep breath, the young prince stepped out from behind his hiding place. Marcus immediately noticed the movement and quickly tried to compose himself, hastily folding the parchment and attempting to stand at attention despite his obvious distress. The guard's training kicked in, and he tried to present the appearance of the strong, reliable protector he was supposed to be. "Your Highness," Marcus said, his voice slightly strained as he bowed. "I did not realize you were in this area of the palace. Is there something you need? Should I escort you back to your tutors?" Alexander could see that Marcus was trying hard to hide his distress, but the young prince had always been perceptive when it came to reading people's emotions. The guard's eyes were still worried, and his hands, though now clasped behind his back, were still trembling slightly. "Marcus," Alexander said gently, using the guard's name instead of simply addressing him by rank, which caught the young man by surprise. "I could not help but notice that you seemed troubled. Is there something wrong? Perhaps something I could help with?" The guard looked shocked that a member of the royal family would not only remember his name, but also express concern for his well-being. In his village, the local lords rarely acknowledged the common people, let alone offered to help them with their problems. "Your Highness, I am fine," Marcus stammered, though his voice betrayed his words. "There is nothing that should concern you. I am here to serve and protect, not to burden you with any personal matters." Alexander studied the guard's face carefully. He could see the internal struggle Marcus was having between his duty to appear strong and his obvious need for help. The young prince had learned from his parents that sometimes the most important decisions were not the ones made in grand throne rooms or council chambers, but in quiet moments like this one. "Marcus," the prince said again, his voice carrying a maturity that seemed beyond his 12 years, "I have noticed that you have been working very hard since you arrived at the palace. You are always at your post, always ready to serve, but even the strongest people sometimes need help. What is troubling you?" The kindness in the young prince's voice, combined with his genuine concern, began to break down the barriers that Marcus had built around his problems. The guard had been struggling alone with his burden, feeling that he had no one to turn to in the palace hierarchy. Now, unexpectedly, he found himself face to face with compassion from the most unlikely source. Marcus stood in silence for a long moment, wrestling with whether to confide in the young prince. The training he had received emphasized that guards should never burden the royal family with personal problems, but Alexander's genuine concern was unlike anything he had experienced since arriving at the palace. The other nobles treated guards as invisible fixtures, necessary but not worth acknowledging as real people with real struggles. Finally, Marcus's resolve crumbled. He reached into his armor and pulled out the crumpled parchment that had been causing him such distress. His hands were still shaking as he held it, and Alexander could see tears beginning to form in the young guard's eyes. "Your Highness," Marcus began, his voice barely above a whisper. "This morning I received word from my village. My younger sister, she is very ill. The village healer says she needs medicine that can only be found in the capital city, but my family has no money to purchase it." Alexander listened intently as Marcus explained his situation. The guard came from a family of farmers who had worked the same land for generations. They were honest, hard-working people, but they lived simply and had little money beyond what was needed for basic survival. Marcus had taken the position at the palace partly because the salary would help support his family back home. "The medicine costs more than my family earns in an entire year," Marcus continued, his voice breaking slightly. "My sister is only 8 years old, and the healer says that without this treatment, she may not survive the coming winter. I have been trying to think of a solution, but I cannot ask for an advance on my salary. The other guards would think I am irresponsible with money and I might lose my position." The young prince felt his heart ache as he listened to Marcus's story. Alexander had grown up surrounded by luxury and comfort, but his parents had taught him to understand that not everyone was so fortunate. He had heard about families struggling to make ends meet, but this was the first time he had encountered such a situation directly. "What is your sister's name?" Alexander asked gently, showing that he cared about Marcus as a person, not just as a guard with a problem to solve. "Emma, Your Highness. She is the brightest child you could ever meet. She loves to read, even though we have few books in our village. She dreams of one day seeing the capital city and maybe even the palace." Marcus smiled sadly as he spoke about his sister. "She always asked me to tell her stories about what it is like to serve the royal family." Alexander could see how much Marcus loved his sister and how desperate he was to help her. The guard had been carrying this burden alone, trying to maintain his duties while worrying constantly about his family. The young prince understood that this was exactly the kind of situation where his position could make a real difference in someone's life. "Marcus, how much does this medicine cost?" Alexander asked, though he suspected that any amount would be overwhelming for a farming family. 50 gold coins, Your Highness. It might as well be 1,000 for all the hope my family has of raising such a sum." Marcus looked down at his hands, feeling ashamed that he could not provide for his family despite having a position at the royal palace. Alexander's mind began working quickly. 50 gold coins was indeed a significant amount for a common family, but it was less than what the royal family spent on decorative flowers for a single feast. The young prince had his own allowance, money that his parents gave him to learn about managing finances, but he had never spent much of it because he had everything he needed. "Marcus, I want you to know that you are not alone in this, Alexander said firmly. Your sister Emma sounds like a remarkable young girl, and she deserves every chance to recover and pursue her dreams. The guard looked up in surprise, not expecting such a response from a 12-year-old prince. In his experience, nobles might express polite sympathy for the problems of common people, but they rarely took any real action to help. Your Highness, I did not tell you this story to ask for help, Marcus said quickly, worried that he might have overstepped boundaries. I know that my personal problems are not your responsibility. I suppose I just needed someone to listen, and you showed such kindness. Marcus, stop, Alexander interrupted gently but firmly. Do you think that your service to this palace, your dedication to protecting my family means nothing to me? Do you think that your sister's life is less important because you were born in a village instead of a palace? The guard was stunned by the prince's words. He had expected polite sympathy at best, or perhaps a lecture about not bringing personal problems to work. Instead, he was hearing something that sounded like genuine care and respect. Alexander continued, I have been watching you since you arrived here, Marcus. You work harder than guards who have been here for years. You are always respectful to the servants, you help others without being asked, and you never complain about difficult assignments. You represent the very best of what it means to serve this kingdom. Marcus felt overwhelmed by the prince's words. In his village, he had been respected as someone who had achieved a prestigious position, but in the palace he often felt like he was barely keeping up with expectations. Hearing that the prince had not only noticed his efforts but valued them was more meaningful than any formal recognition could have been. But most importantly, Alexander continued, you are a good brother who loves his sister. That tells me more about your character than anything else could. Emma is lucky to have someone who cares about her as much as you do. The young prince paused for a moment, his mind made up about what he needed to do. He had been raised to understand that true leadership meant taking action when action was needed, not just offering empty words of comfort. Marcus, I am going to help you get the medicine your sister needs, Alexander declared with the confidence of someone who had never been told that something was impossible. Marcus stared at the young prince in disbelief, unable to process what he had just heard. The idea that a member of the royal family would personally involve themselves in the problems of a simple guard seemed impossible. He had been prepared for sympathy, perhaps even some advice, but not for direct action. Your Highness, I cannot accept such generosity, Marcus said, his voice filled with both gratitude and concern. It would not be proper for me to take money from you. The other guards would think I had manipulated your kindness, and it might reflect poorly on your character if people thought you were easily swayed by sob stories. Alexander listened to Marcus's concerns and understood them. The young prince had grown up in a world where every action was scrutinized, where motives were questioned, and where even acts of kindness could be twisted into political weapons. But he had also been raised by parents who taught him that doing the right thing was more important than avoiding criticism. Marcus, I appreciate your concern for my reputation, but I have thought about this carefully, Alexander replied. This is not a decision I am making impulsively. You have served my family faithfully, and your sister deserves to live. These are simple facts that guide my choice. The guard struggled with accepting help, partly because of pride and partly because he genuinely worried about the consequences for the young prince. In his village, accepting charity was sometimes seen as a sign of weakness, and he had worked hard to build a reputation as someone who could take care of himself and his family. But Your Highness, what will your parents say when they discover you have given away 50 gold coins? Will they not be angry that you spent so much money without their permission? Marcus asked, his practical nature making him think about the potential problems this generosity might create. Alexander smiled at the guard's concern, touched that even in his desperate situation, Marcus was worried about getting the prince in trouble. This only confirmed Alexander's belief that the young guard was exactly the kind of person who deserved help. Marcus, my parents taught me that our wealth and position come with responsibilities. They have always said that we are stewards of the kingdom's resources, not just owners of them. I believe they will understand my decision, especially when I explain the circumstances. The young prince paused, then continued with growing conviction. But even if they were to disapprove, I would rather face their displeasure than live with the knowledge that I could have saved a child's life and chose not to act. Some things are more important than avoiding conflict. Marcus felt tears welling up in his eyes as he listened to the prince's words. He had grown up hearing stories about noble families who lived in luxury, while common people suffered. But here was a 12-year-old boy who understood compassion and responsibility in ways that many adults never learned. "Your Highness, I do not know how I could ever repay such kindness," Marcus said, his voice thick with emotion. "My family will be forever in your debt." "Marcus, you repay me every day by serving faithfully and treating people with respect," Alexander replied. "But I do have one request that goes beyond simple repayment." The guard straightened, ready to agree to whatever the prince might ask. "Anything, Your Highness. Whatever you command, I will do." Alexander's expression became serious as he considered his next words carefully. "I want you to promise me that when your sister recovers, and I believe she will, you will tell her this story. I want her to know that there are people in positions of power who care about those who have less. But more importantly, I want her to remember that someday when she is older and perhaps in a position to help others, she should do the same." Marcus was struck by the wisdom in the young prince's request. Alexander was not just solving an immediate problem. He was thinking about how this act of kindness might inspire future acts of kindness. The prince understood that true generosity was not just about giving money, but about creating a cycle of compassion that could continue long after the original gift was forgotten. "I promise, Your Highness," Marcus said solemnly. "Emma will know about your kindness, and she will understand the responsibility that comes with being helped by others." Alexander nodded, satisfied with the guard's promise. But he was not finished with his planning. The young prince had learned from his parents that good intentions needed to be backed up with practical action, and he wanted to make sure that the medicine reached Marcus's sister as quickly as possible. "Now, we need to discuss the practical details," Alexander said, his tone becoming businesslike. "How quickly can a messenger reach your village, and how soon can the medicine be obtained here in the capital?" Marcus was amazed by the prince's thoroughness. Not only was Alexander willing to provide the money, but he was also thinking about the logistics of getting the medicine to Emma before her condition worsened. "A fast rider could reach my village in 3 days, Your Highness, but obtaining the medicine might take longer. The apothecaries who sell such expensive treatments usually require advance orders, and they may want to verify that the buyer has the necessary funds." Alexander frowned as he considered this problem. 3 days to the village, plus time to obtain the medicine, plus 3 more days for the return journey could easily stretch into 2 weeks. If Emma was as sick as Marcus had indicated, time was crucial. "That is too slow," the prince declared. "We need a better solution." The young prince began pacing in the small alcove, his mind working through various possibilities. Marcus watched in amazement as Alexander approached the problem with the same systematic thinking that he probably applied to his royal lessons. "Marcus, I have an idea," Alexander said suddenly, stopping his pacing and turning to face the guard. "What if we bring your sister here to the palace? The royal physician is the best healer in the kingdom, and we have access to medicines that may not even be available to the public apothecaries." Marcus's eyes widened at this suggestion. The idea of bringing his peasant sister to the royal palace seemed like something from a fairy tale, not a real possibility. "Your Highness, could such a thing really be arranged? Would your parents permit a sick village child to be brought to the palace?" Marcus asked, hardly daring to hope that this might be possible. "Marcus, my parents have always taught me that the palace should be a place where justice and mercy can be found by those who need it most. I believe they will support this plan, especially when they understand the circumstances." Alexander's confidence was infectious, and for the first time since receiving the devastating letter about his sister, Marcus began to feel genuine hope that Emma might not only survive, but receive the best possible care. Alexander's mind raced with the details of his plan as he looked at Marcus's hopeful but uncertain expression. The young prince understood that bringing a peasant child to the royal palace would require careful planning, and most importantly, his parents' approval. He knew that his father and mother were compassionate rulers, but they also had to consider the precedent that such actions might set. "Marcus, I need you to write a letter to your family immediately," Alexander commanded with gentle authority. "Tell them that help is coming, and that they should prepare Emma for a journey to the capital. Make sure they understand that she will receive the best medical care available in the kingdom." The guard nodded eagerly, pulled out a piece of parchment and a quill from his belongings, and began writing with shaking hands. His penmanship was simple but clear, reflecting his basic education and the urgency of the situation. Alexander watched as Marcus poured his heart into the letter, explaining the miraculous turn of events and the hope that now existed for Emma's recovery. While Marcus wrote, Alexander considered how best to approach his parents. He knew that simply asking for permission might not be enough. He needed to present his case in a way that would appeal to their sense of justice and their roles as protectors of all their subjects, not just the wealthy and powerful. Your Highness, Marcus said as he finished the letter, I have explained the situation to my family, but I am still concerned about the propriety of bringing Emma to the palace. What if she is too ill to travel? What if her presence somehow disrupts the important work of the court? Alexander could see that despite his gratitude, Marcus was still struggling with the magnitude of what the prince was proposing. The guard had been raised to know his place in society, and the idea of his family receiving royal attention was overwhelming. Marcus, my parents have always taught me that a kingdom is only as strong as its most vulnerable citizens. Alexander explained patiently, if we cannot help a sick child when we have the power to do so, then what good is all our wealth and privilege? Emma's life has value not because of who she is, but simply because she is one of our people. The wisdom in the young prince's words struck Marcus deeply. He had spent his life believing that people like his family were too insignificant to matter to the royal family. But Alexander was teaching him that true leadership meant caring for everyone under the crown's protection. Now, Alexander continued, we need to get this letter to your village as quickly as possible, and I need to speak with my parents about bringing Emma here. Are you prepared to trust me with this responsibility? Marcus stood and bowed deeply to the young prince. Your Highness, I would trust you with my life and, more importantly, with my sister's life. I do not understand how I became so fortunate as to serve under someone with such a noble heart. Alexander smiled at the guard's words but remained focused on the task at hand. Save your gratitude until Emma is well again, Marcus. We still have much work to do. The young prince led Marcus through the palace corridors, no longer the wandering child who had been avoiding his tutors, but a determined leader with a mission. As they walked, Alexander explained his strategy for approaching the king and queen. I will speak to my parents during the evening meal, when the whole family is together. My brother Edmund and sister Catherine should hear about this as well, because someday they may face similar decisions. This will be a lesson for all of us about what it means to rule with compassion. Marcus marveled at how thoroughly Alexander had thought through every aspect of the situation. The prince was not just reacting emotionally to a sad story. He was demonstrating the kind of strategic thinking that would serve him well as a future leader. They reached the palace's message center, where royal messengers prepared for journeys throughout the kingdom. Alexander approached the captain of the messenger service, a grizzled veteran named Sir Robert who had served the royal family for over 20 years. Sir Robert, Alexander said with the confident tone of someone accustomed to being obeyed, I need your fastest rider to deliver an urgent message to Marcus's village. This is a matter of life and death. Sir Robert looked surprised to see the young prince in the message center, especially accompanied by one of the guards and speaking about urgent personal business. However, he had learned long ago not to question the royal family's requests, no matter how unusual they might seem. Of course, Your Highness. Where is this village, and how quickly do you need the message delivered? Sir Robert asked, already mentally calculating distances and selecting the best rider for the job. Marcus provided the details about his village's location, and Sir Robert nodded thoughtfully. We can have a rider there by tomorrow evening if he leaves within the hour. Is there anything else you need, Your Highness? Yes, Alexander replied. I want you to send your best rider, and I want him to wait for a response from Marcus's family. There may be additional instructions coming from my parents about bringing someone back to the palace. Sir Robert raised an eyebrow at this unusual request, but nodded his agreement. It shall be done as you command, Your Highness. As the messenger captain prepared the dispatch, Alexander turned back to Marcus. Now comes the most important part of our plan. I need to convince my parents that bringing Emma to the palace is not just an act of charity, but the right thing to do as rulers of this kingdom. Marcus watched as the young prince prepared himself mentally for what would clearly be a challenging conversation. The guard was amazed by Alexander's determination and the maturity he was showing in handling such a complex situation. Your Highness, what if your parents refuse? What if they believe that helping my family would set a dangerous precedent that might encourage others to seek similar help? Marcus asked, voicing his deepest fear. Alexander considered this question seriously before responding. Marcus, if my parents refuse, then I will use my own resources to get Emma the help she needs. But I do not believe they will refuse. They raised me to understand that with great power comes great responsibility, and they have always practiced what they preached. The young prince paused, then added with growing confidence, besides, I think they will be proud to see that their lessons about compassion and justice have taken root. This is not just about helping your sister. It is about proving that our family's values are more than just words. As they prepared to part ways, Alexander giving Marcus time to compose himself before returning to his duties. The guard felt compelled to express his amazement at everything that had transpired. Your Highness, when I woke up this morning, I thought my world was ending. I saw no solution to my sister's illness, and I felt completely alone with my burden. Now, because of your kindness, I have hope again. I do not know how to thank you adequately. Alexander placed a reassuring hand on the guard's shoulder. Marcus thanked me by continuing to serve faithfully, and by raising Emma to understand that kindness and compassion can change the world. If this plan succeeds, it will be because good people like you and your family deserve help when they need it most. That evening, the royal family gathered in the smaller dining hall for their private meal, away from the formality of state dinners and court ceremonies. King Philip, a wise ruler in his mid-40s, sat at the head of the table, while Queen Isabella, known throughout the kingdom for her charitable works, sat opposite him. Prince Edmund, 18 and already showing the bearing of a future military leader, sat beside his younger brother Alexander, while Princess Catherine, 16 and graceful beyond her years, completed the family circle. Alexander had spent the afternoon carefully planning how to present Marcus's situation to his family. He knew that timing would be crucial, and he waited until the conversation had turned to the day's events before speaking up. Father, Mother? Alexander began, his voice carrying a seriousness that immediately caught everyone's attention. I encountered a situation today that I believe requires our family's attention and action. King Philip set down his goblet and looked at his youngest son with interest. Alexander had always been the most thoughtful of his children, often bringing up matters that others might overlook, and the king had learned to listen carefully when Alexander spoke in such a serious tone. Tell us what happened, son, the king said encouragingly. Alexander took a deep breath and began to recount his encounter with Marcus, being careful to present the facts clearly and emphasize both the guard's character and his sister's desperate need for medical care. He spoke about Marcus's dedication to his duties, his love for his family, and the impossible choice he faced between his job and his sister's life. Queen Isabella listened with growing concern and compassion, her heart touched by the story of a young girl fighting for her life while her brother struggled to help her. The queen had always been particularly sensitive to the plight of children, having worked extensively with orphanages and hospitals throughout the kingdom. This young guard sounds like exactly the kind of person we want serving our family, Queen Isabella said when Alexander finished his account. His willingness to put duty first, even while facing such personal anguish, speaks well of his character. Prince Edmund, ever practical in his military training, asked the obvious question. Alexander, what exactly are you proposing we do to help this Marcus and his sister? Alexander straightened in his chair and presented his plan with the confidence of someone who had thought through every detail. I propose that we bring Emma to the palace where Dr. Harrison can examine her and provide the best possible treatment. If she needs medicine, we can obtain it immediately. If she needs ongoing care, she can remain here until she recovers. Princess Catherine, who had inherited her mother's compassionate nature, immediately supported the idea. That sounds like exactly what we should do. We have the resources and the ability to help, so why would we not use them to save a child's life? But King Philip, while moved by the story, had to consider the broader implications of such an unprecedented action. Son, I admire your compassion and your desire to help this family. However, bringing a peasant child to the royal palace for medical treatment would set a precedent that could have far-reaching consequences. What happens when other families learn of this and demand similar help? Alexander had anticipated this objection and was ready with his response. Father, I understand your concern about precedent, but I believe this situation is unique. Marcus has served our family faithfully, demonstrating exactly the kind of loyalty and character we value in our guards. More importantly, We have the power to save a child's life with minimal effort on our part. Is that not exactly the kind of situation where our privileged position should be used for good? Queen Isabella nodded approvingly at her son's reasoning. Philip, remember what we have always taught our children about the responsibilities that come with power. How can we expect them to be compassionate rulers if we do not demonstrate compassion when the opportunity presents itself? The king considered his wife's words carefully. He had always prided himself on being a just ruler who cared about all his subjects, not just the wealthy and powerful. The idea of letting a child die when he had the power to save her was deeply troubling to him. But what about the practical concerns? Prince Edmund asked, his military training making him think about logistics. How do we know this girl can safely make the journey to the palace? What if her illness is contagious? What if treating her here endangers other members of the court? Alexander addressed his brother's concerns methodically. I have already spoken with Sir Robert about sending our fastest messenger to Marcus's village. The messenger can assess Emma's condition and determine whether she is strong enough to travel. As for the risk of contagion, Dr. Harrison is the most knowledgeable physician in the kingdom. If anyone can safely treat her while protecting others, it would be him. King Philip was impressed by his youngest son's thorough planning and mature approach to the situation. The 12-year-old was demonstrating exactly the kind of leadership qualities that would serve him well in the future. Alexander, the king said slowly, you have presented this case very thoughtfully, and I can see that you have considered many of the practical challenges involved. But I want you to understand that if we do this, we are not just helping one family. We are making a statement about what kind of rulers we are and what we value as a royal family. I understand that completely, Father, Alexander replied, and I believe that the statement we would be making is exactly the right one. We would be showing our people that we care about them as individuals, not just as subjects. We would be demonstrating that justice and mercy are not just words we speak in ceremonies, but principles we live by. Princess Catherine spoke up again, her voice filled with conviction. Father, I think Alexander is right. If we have the power to save Emma's life and we choose not to use it, what does that say about us as people? How can we live with ourselves knowing that we let a child die when we could have helped her? Queen Isabella reached across the table and placed her hand on her husband's arm. Philip, I have spent years working with families like Marcus's, and I know how rare it is to find someone who combines loyalty, hard work, and genuine character the way this young guard apparently does. If we help his sister, we are not just saving her life. We are showing him and others like him that their service and their sacrifices matter to us. The king sat in silence for several minutes, weighing all the arguments he had heard. His children watched him carefully, understanding that this decision would reveal something important about the kind of family and the kind of rulers they were. Finally, King Philip looked up and addressed his youngest son directly. Alexander, I want you to understand that what you are proposing will require significant resources, careful planning, and ongoing commitment. If we bring this child to the palace, we become responsible for her well-being until she is completely recovered. Are you prepared for that level of responsibility? Yes, Father, Alexander replied without hesitation. I am prepared to see this through to the end, whatever that may require. The king nodded slowly, his decision made. Then we will do as you suggest. Send word to Marcus that his sister will be brought to the palace and will receive the best medical care we can provide. Dr. Harrison should be informed immediately so that he can prepare for her arrival. Alexander felt a surge of joy and relief, but he maintained his composure as he thanked his parents for their support. Around the table, his siblings smiled with pride at their younger brother's successful advocacy for a cause he believed in. 3 weeks later, the palace had been transformed by the presence of a special young patient. Emma, Marcus's 8-year-old sister, had arrived at the royal residence weak and pale, but under the care of Dr. Harrison, the kingdom's finest physician, she was making a remarkable recovery that amazed everyone who witnessed it. The young girl had been given a beautiful room in the guest wing of the palace, with large windows that let in plenty of sunlight and a view of the royal gardens. Despite her initial illness, Emma's bright personality had quickly won over the palace staff, from the kitchen servants who prepared special meals to help her regain her strength, to the guards who had become protective of the brave little girl, who never complained about her treatments. Alexander visited Emma every day, bringing her books from the royal library and listening to her stories about life in her village. The young prince was fascinated by her perspective on the world, so different from his own sheltered upbringing. Emma spoke about helping her parents with farming, caring for animals, and the simple pleasures of village festivals and community gatherings. "Your Highness," Emma said during one of their daily visits, her voice much stronger than when she had first arrived. "Marcus told me that you saved my life. Is that really true?" Alexander sat in the chair beside her bed, considering how to answer. He had learned much about humility and leadership during the past 3 weeks, watching how his decision had affected not just Emma and Marcus, but the entire palace community. "Emma, I think it would be more accurate to say that many people worked together to save your life," Alexander replied thoughtfully. "Marcus's love for you brought the situation to my attention. My parents provided the resources and permission. Dr. Harrison provided the medical expertise. The palace staff has cared for you with dedication. I was simply the person who happened to be in the right place at the right time to help connect all these good people." Emma studied the prince's face with the directness that only children possess. "But Marcus says you could have just walked away when you saw him crying. He says most people would have pretended they didn't notice or would have told him to handle his problems himself. Why did you stop to help?" The question caught Alexander off guard with its simplicity and depth. Over the past weeks, he had been praised by his parents, his siblings, and various court officials for his compassion and leadership. But Emma's innocent question made him examine his own motivations more carefully. "I suppose I stopped because I was raised to believe that when you have the power to help someone, especially someone who is serving your family faithfully, you have a responsibility to act," Alexander said slowly. "But if I am being completely honest, I also stopped because I could see that Marcus is a good person who was suffering, and I did not want him to suffer alone." Emma smiled at this answer, and Alexander could see why Marcus loved his sister so much. Despite everything she had been through, she radiated warmth and intelligence that drew people to her. "Marcus also told me that you made him promise to tell me this story when I got better, so that I would remember to help others when I grow up," Emma continued. "I want you to know that I will never forget what you and your family have done for me, but I also want to tell you something else." Alexander leaned forward, curious about what the 8-year-old wanted to share with him. "I want to become a healer like Dr. Harrison," Emma declared with the confidence of someone who had found her calling. "I want to learn everything I can about medicine so that I can go back to my village and help people who get sick. Dr. Harrison says that if I study hard and learn to read and write properly, I might even be able to come back to the capital someday to learn from the physicians here." The young prince felt a surge of excitement at Emma's declaration. This was exactly the kind of long-term impact he had hoped his decision might have, though he had not dared to expect such a clear and ambitious response. "Emma, that is a wonderful goal," Alexander said enthusiastically. "Dr. Harrison is right that you would need to study very hard, but I believe you have the intelligence and determination to succeed. I would be honored to help you pursue that dream in any way I can." Over the following days, Alexander spoke with Dr. Harrison about Emma's interest in medicine. The physician, who had been impressed by the girl's quick recovery and her intelligent questions about her treatment, agreed to provide her with basic medical texts and to teach her fundamental concepts during her remaining time at the palace. King Philip and Queen Isabella watched their youngest son's continued involvement with Emma's care and education with growing pride. They could see that the experience had matured Alexander in ways that formal lessons never could have achieved. He was learning firsthand about the weight of responsibility, the complexity of leadership decisions, and the long-term consequences of compassionate action. Alexander has shown wisdom beyond his years in handling this situation, Queen Isabella commented to her husband as they observed their son reading with Emma in the palace garden. "He has learned that true leadership is not about making grand gestures, but about paying attention to the needs of individuals and taking thoughtful action." King Philip nodded in agreement. More importantly, he has learned that helping others is not just about solving immediate problems, but about creating opportunities for people to help themselves and others in the future. Emma's desire to become a healer shows that our son's generosity has planted seeds that may bear fruit for generations. As Emma's recovery neared completion and preparations began for her return to her village, the entire palace community had been changed by her presence. The servants had rediscovered the joy of caring for someone purely out of kindness rather than duty. The guards, led by Marcus's example, had developed a stronger sense of connection to the people they served. Even the royal family had been reminded of the profound satisfaction that comes from using their privileges to make a real difference in someone's life. On Emma's last day at the palace, Alexander presented her with a leather satchel containing medical texts, writing materials, and a personal letter of recommendation to Dr. Harrison's colleague in the nearest major town to her village. He also gave her something even more precious, a standing invitation to return to the palace whenever she needed guidance or resources in pursuing her medical studies. "Emma," Alexander said as they said their goodbyes, "I want you to remember that you are not just returning to your village as someone who was helped by the royal family. You are returning as someone with knowledge, skills, and connections that can benefit your entire community. That makes you a leader, regardless of your age or background." Emma hugged the young prince, tears of gratitude in her eyes but also excitement about the future stretching before her. "Thank you, Prince Alexander. I promise that I will use everything I have learned here to help others just as you helped me." Marcus, who had watched his sister's transformation from a dying child to a confident young woman with ambitious dreams, approached Alexander with emotions too deep for simple words of thanks. "Your Highness," Marcus said, his voice thick with feeling, "you have given my family more than just Emma's life. You have given her a future, a purpose, and the tools to achieve her dreams. But more than that, you have shown me what true nobility looks like. I will serve your family for the rest of my life, not out of duty, but out of genuine love and respect." Alexander clasped the guard's shoulder firmly. "Marcus, your loyalty and dedication inspired this entire situation. Emma's recovery is as much a result of your love for her as it is of anything else. I am proud to have you serving my family, and I know that Emma will make us all proud of what she accomplishes with her life." As the royal carriage carried Emma back to her village, accompanied by Marcus and a supply of medicines for the local healer, Alexander stood at his window watching until they disappeared from view. He understood that this experience had changed him fundamentally, teaching him lessons about leadership, compassion, and responsibility that would guide him for the rest of his life. Years later, when Prince Alexander became King Alexander, he would be remembered throughout the kingdom for his wisdom, his fairness, and his genuine care for all his subjects. But those who knew him best would say that the foundation of his great reign was built on a single decision he made as a 12-year-old boy, when he chose to help a guard in distress and discovered that true power lies not in commanding others, but in lifting them up.